The harsh wind howled across the Wyoming territory as Willow Kane stared out the window of her small homestead, the emptiness of the night reflecting the void in her heart. It had been 6 months since she buried her husband beneath the old oak, leaving her alone with their newborn son and a plot of land that demanded more than she could give. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life on the frontier had dissolved into a daily struggle for survival that left her bones weary and her spirit crushed. Willow jumped at the sound of hoofbeats approaching her cabin. Visitors after dark rarely brought good news in this untamed corner of the West. She quickly grabbed the shotgun leaning against the wall, cradling it in her arms like a second child. The small cabin, built by her husband's hands, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable under the moonlight. A knock at the door made her heart leap to her throat. "Madam, anyone home?" a deep voice called out. "I saw your light from the trail. My horse threw a shoe, and I could use a place to rest till morning." Willow hesitated, her finger hovering near the trigger. "State your name and business," she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "Tucker Wade, madam. Just passing through on my way to Laramie. I mean no harm." Something in his voice, a gentle firmness that reminded her of her father, made Willow lower the shotgun slightly. Travelers needed help sometimes. That was the code of the West. Still, she'd heard stories of women alone being easy targets. "Step back from the door," she instructed. "I'm armed." She opened the door just wide enough to see the stranger. The moonlight illuminated a tall figure with broad shoulders, dusty from the trail. His face was half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered by several days' worth of beard. His clothes were worn but clean, and he stood with his hands visible at his sides, a gesture of peace she appreciated. "Thank you kindly," Tucker said, removing his hat. His eyes, deep blue even in the dim light, met hers with unexpected warmth. "I won't be any trouble. Just need a corner to lay my bedroll till first light." Before Willow could respond, a thin wail rose from the back room. Her son, James, had woken again. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion washing over her. It had been 3 nights of little sleep as the baby struggled with colic. "You have a little one," Tucker observed softly. Willow nodded, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance in the state of her home. "My son. He's 4 months old and doesn't take kindly to night." Tucker's expression softened further. "My sister had 5. I remember those days well." Another sharp cry pierced the air, and Willow sighed. "You can come in, but the gun stays with me." Tucker nodded respectfully and stepped inside, ducking slightly under the doorframe. The cabin was small but neat, with a wood stove in the corner providing warmth against the autumn chill. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and a narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. A curtain separated the main room from what Tucker assumed was where the baby slept. "Much obliged," he said, setting his hat on a peg by the door. Up close, Willow could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting in the sun. His movements were careful, as if trying not to take up too much space in the small cabin. The baby's cries grew more insistent, and Willow leaned the shotgun against the wall with a reluctant glance. "I need to tend to him." Tucker sat down on one of the wooden chairs, keeping his distance. "Take your time, madam." Behind the curtain, Willow lifted her son from his small crib. His face was red with effort, tiny fists balled in frustration. "Shh, James," she whispered, bouncing him gently. "Mama's here now." But James was inconsolable, his cries growing louder as she paced the small space. The past few nights had been the same hours of walking, rocking, singing, with only brief moments of respite before he started again. Her arms ached, her head pounded, and tears of exhaustion threatened to spill down her cheeks. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Tucker was still sitting patiently at the table, his saddlebags on the floor beside him. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the wailing infant, but his expression remained gentle. "Colicky?" he asked, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the crying. Willow nodded, continuing to rock James against her shoulder. Nothing helps. I've tried everything I know. Tucker watched her for a moment, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders sagged with fatigue. My sister used to swear by a little sugar water and mint for colic. Don't suppose you have any mint growing? Dried some this summer, Willow admitted, nodding toward a bunch of herbs hanging from a roof beam. Tucker stood slowly. May I? When Willow nodded, he reached up and carefully broke off a few leaves. Do you have a pot I could use? Too tired to be suspicious, Willow pointed to the small shelf where she kept her cookware. She continued pacing with James as Tucker moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, heating water on the stove and crushing mint leaves between his fingers. Used to help my sister with her young'uns, he explained, catching her curious gaze. Her husband was often away working the railroads. While the mint steeped in the hot water, Tucker glanced around the cabin, his eyes falling on a photograph on the shelf. Willow, in a simple dress, standing beside a serious-looking man with a full beard. Your husband? He asked quietly. Willow nodded, her throat tightening. John. Fever took him last spring, just after James was born. Tucker's face softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Kane. Willow, she corrected automatically, then wondered why she'd offered her first name to this stranger. Willow, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. He strained the mint tea into a cup and added a small spoonful of sugar from the canister on her shelf. After letting it cool, he brought it to her. Just a few drops on your finger for him to suck. Won't cure it, but might ease his discomfort some. Willow sat in the rocking chair by the stove, adjusting James in her arms. She dipped her pinky finger into the warm liquid and let her son suck on it. To her surprise, his crying subsided slightly as he tasted the sweet mint. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is the first time he's quieted in hours. Tucker nodded and returned to his seat at the table, giving her space. Like I said, had plenty of practice. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire in the stove and James's occasional whimpers. Willow continued to offer him drops of the mint tea, grateful for the momentary peace. But as midnight approached, James grew restless again. The tea's soothing effect had worn off, and his cries returned with renewed vigor. Willow felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes as she stood to resume her pacing. How long has it been since you've had a proper rest? Tucker asked, watching her sway with the baby. Willow gave a humorless laugh. What's that? Tucker stood up from his chair. Madam Willow, why don't you let me take him for a spell? She instinctively pulled James closer. I couldn't possibly. Your baby was crying at midnight, Tucker said softly. Go rest. I'll rock him till he sleeps. Willow stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or danger. But all she saw was kindness and genuine concern in those blue eyes. You don't even know us, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Tucker's smile was gentle. I know what it's like to be at the end of your rope, and I know no harm will come to either of you while I'm here. Perhaps it was the exhaustion clouding her judgment, or perhaps it was something in his steady gaze that inspired trust, but Willow found herself carefully transferring her son into the cowboy's large hands. Tucker cradled James with surprising tenderness, supporting his head and settling him against his chest. There we go, little man, he murmured. Your mama needs some sleep. Willow hesitated, torn between collapsing onto her bed and taking back her child from this stranger. I'll be right here, Tucker assured her, settling into the rocking chair. Not going anywhere. Too tired to argue further, Willow retreated to her bed, keeping her eyes on them as she lay down fully clothed. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was Tucker's broad shoulders gently rocking as he hummed a low tune to her son. When Willow awoke, daylight was streaming through the cabin windows. She sat up with a jolt, panic seizing her chest when she realized how long she'd slept. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. James, she called, scrambling to her feet. Out here, madam, came Tucker's voice from the porch. Willow rushed outside to find Tucker seated on the wooden step, her son sleeping peacefully in the crook of his arm. The morning sun bathed them in golden light, making James's wispy hair shine like copper. "He finally fell asleep around 3, Tucker explained quietly. "Been out like a light since. Didn't want to risk waking him by moving around inside." Relief flooded through Willow as she sank down onto the step beside them. "You stayed up all night with him?" Tucker shrugged, as if it were nothing. "Figured you needed the rest more than I did." Willow studied her son's peaceful face, then looked at Tucker. In the morning light, she could see him clearly for the first time, the sun-weathered skin, the crinkles around his eyes, the streak of silver at his temple that belied his otherwise youthful appearance. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way she hadn't encountered since John's death. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the gift of uninterrupted sleep he had given her. Tucker nodded, carefully transferring James back to her arms. "He's a good boy. Strong grip, too." He held up his finger, showing where James had wrapped his tiny hand around it. Willow smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like months. "He's stubborn, like his father." Tucker stood, stretching his tall frame. "I should see about fixing that shoe on my horse and be on my way." A surprising disappointment settled in Willow's chest. "At least let me fix you some breakfast first. It's the least I can do." Tucker accepted with a gracious nod, and they moved back inside the cabin. While Willow prepared a simple meal of cornbread and bacon, Tucker told her about his journey. He was a former cavalry soldier turned rancher, heading to Laramie to purchase breeding stock for his small spread near Cheyenne. "Not much yet," he admitted as they ate. 50 acres and a handful of cattle, but it's mine. Free and clear." Willow listened, envying the pride in his voice. Her own future felt precarious, the ranch too much for her to manage alone, but too precious to abandon. After breakfast, Tucker inspected his horse and frowned at the damaged shoe. "Need to get this fixed proper before I can continue." "Harrison's place is the nearest blacksmith," Willow said. "It's a half-day's ride east." Tucker nodded thoughtfully, looking round the homestead. His gaze lingered on the unrepaired fence, the stack of unsplit wood, and the neglected garden. "Seems to me you could use a hand around here," he observed carefully. "If you'd be willing to put me up for a few days, I could help with some of these chores before moving on." Willow hesitated. Having a stranger stay on her property went against everything she'd been taught about caution. But Tucker had proven himself trustworthy with her most precious possession, and the work around the homestead was overwhelming her. "I can pay," she began, but Tucker shook his head. "Room and board is payment enough," he said firmly. "I'll be saving money not staying at a hotel in town." And so, Tucker Wade stayed. What was meant to be a few days stretched into a week as he repaired fences, split wood, and helped Willow prepare the homestead for the coming winter. Each evening, when James grew fussy, Tucker would take him for a while, allowing Willow to catch her breath and attend to other tasks. On the 5th day, as they worked side by side harvesting the last of the garden vegetables, Willow found herself studying Tucker's hands, strong and calloused, yet gentle when they needed to be. The same hands that wielded an axe with powerful strokes could cradle her son with tender care. "You're good with him," she commented as Tucker bounced James on his knee that evening. The baby had begun to recognize Tucker, greeting him with toothless grins and excited kicks. Tucker smiled down at the infant. "He makes it easy." "Not all men would think so," Willow observed. "John was nervous around him when he was newborn. Said he was too fragile." Tucker chuckled. "Babies are tougher than they look. It's the adults who are fragile sometimes." His eyes met hers briefly, and Willow felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. She looked away quickly, busying herself with mending a shirt. That night, as Willow nursed James before bed, she heard Tucker out on the porch, playing a harmonica, a soft, melancholy tune that drifted through the cabin like a memory. When she put James down, sleeping soundly for once, she found herself drawn outside. Tucker looked up as she stepped onto the porch, lowering the instrument. "Hope I didn't disturb you." Willow shook her head, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cool evening air. It's beautiful. What's it called? Shenandoah, Tucker replied. Old song my pa used to play. Willow sat beside him on the step, careful to leave space between them. You play well. Tucker smiled, turning the harmonica in his hands. Not much else to do on long cattle drives. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Willow found herself more aware of Tucker's presence than she wanted to be, the clean scent of soap from his evening wash, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him even across the space between them. Tomorrow I should head to the blacksmith, Tucker said finally, his voice quiet in the darkness. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Willow's heart sank at his words. Over the past week, she had grown accustomed to his presence, to having another adult to talk with, to the way he eased her burdens without making her feel helpless. The thought of returning to her solitary struggle made her chest tighten with dread. You haven't imposed, she said carefully. Your help has been invaluable. Tucker turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Even so, I can't stay forever. No, Willow agreed, though a part of her wished it weren't true. You have your own place waiting. Tucker nodded, his gaze returning to the stars. It gets lonely sometimes, a man on his own. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Willow thought about the long, quiet days and the even longer nights she'd endured since John's death. Yes, she whispered. It does. Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. Something shifted in the space between them, a recognition of shared loneliness, of unexpected connection. The moment was broken by James's cry from inside the cabin. Willow stood quickly, grateful for the interruption before she could say or do something foolish. Good night, Tucker, she said, retreating toward the door. Good night, Willow, he replied, and the way he said her name made her pause briefly before hurrying inside to her son. The next morning, Tucker rode east to Harrison's blacksmith shop, promising to return by sundown. The cabin felt eerily quiet in his absence, and Willow found herself glancing toward the trail throughout the day, watching for his return. James seemed to feel Tucker's absence too, fussing more than usual and refusing to nap. He'll be back soon, Willow assured her son, though she wondered if she was trying to convince herself more than him. As the afternoon waned with no sign of Tucker, worry began to gnaw at her. The trails could be dangerous outlaws, accidents, wild animals. When the sun began to set, turning the sky a brilliant orange, Willow's concern deepened. She paced the cabin floor, alternating between watching the trail and trying to soothe an increasingly cranky James. It was well after dark when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her as Tucker emerged from the darkness, leading his horse with the newly shod hoof. But as he came closer, Willow noticed he was walking with a slight limp. What happened? She asked as he reached the porch. Tucker grimaced. Horse got spooked by a rattler on the way back. Threw me off and I landed wrong on my ankle. Nothing serious, just twisted it some. Willow helped him inside and insisted he sit while she examined his injury. The ankle was swollen but not broken. She wrapped it tightly with strips of cloth and instructed him to keep it elevated. Looks like you're stuck here a few more days, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the flutter of happiness in her chest. Tucker smiled wryly. Seems I've worn out my welcome and then some. Nonsense, Willow replied, busying herself with making tea. We're glad for the company, aren't we, James? The baby gurgled from his blanket on the floor, waving his arms at the sound of Tucker's voice. Tucker's expression softened as he watched the infant. He's growing so fast. Too fast, Willow agreed with a wistful smile. Soon he'll be crawling, then walking, and I'll never keep up with him. You'll manage, Tucker said confidently. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Willow looked up, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Sometimes I don't feel very strong. That's when you are the strongest, Tucker replied, his blue eyes serious. when you keep going despite feeling like you can't. Willow felt something shift inside her at his words, a small crack in the wall of grief and loneliness she'd built around herself since John's death. For the first time, someone saw not just her struggles, but her strength in facing them. That night, after James fell asleep, Willow and Tucker sat at the table playing checkers by lamplight. Tucker told stories of his time in the cavalry, of the places he'd seen, and the people he'd met. Willow shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, of coming west with her parents as a girl, of meeting John at a harvest dance when she was 18. He was so serious, she recalled with a fond smile. Never laughed much, but when he did, it lit up his whole face. Tucker nodded, moving his checker piece thoughtfully. Sounds like a good man. He was, Willow agreed. Hard-working, honest. He would have been a wonderful father. She swallowed hard against the familiar ache of loss. Tucker reached across the table and briefly touched her hand, a gesture so unexpected that Willow nearly pulled away in surprise. But his touch was warm and comforting, and she found herself turning her palm upward, her fingers curling around his. "I'm sorry you lost him," Tucker said softly, "and that James won't know his father." Willow nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, the checker game forgotten. Later, lying in her bed with James sleeping soundly in his crib, Willow stared at the ceiling, thinking about the way Tucker's hand had felt in hers, strong and steady. Like an anchor in a storm. It had been so long since she'd been touched with tenderness that her skin still tingled from the brief contact. She told herself it meant nothing, just a moment of human connection, of shared understanding. Tucker would heal, and he would leave, continuing on his journey while she remained here with her son and her memories. That was how it should be, how it needed to be. But in the quiet darkness, Willow couldn't deny the spark of something new awakening inside her, a feeling she had thought buried forever in the grave with John. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Tucker's ankle improved slowly, allowing him to help with smaller tasks around the cabin while Willow handled the more strenuous chores. They worked side by side, their conversations flowing more easily as barriers of formality fell away. Tucker taught Willow how to play the harmonica, his hands guiding hers to the proper positions on the instrument. Willow showed Tucker how to make her mother's apple dumplings with the last of the season's fruit. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, taking turns holding James, who seemed to thrive on the attention from both adults. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Tucker asked about her plans for the homestead. "Winter's coming," he observed, his experienced eye noting the signs of the changing season. "Will you stay here alone?" Willow's hands stilled on her work. "I don't have much choice. This land is all I have left of John, all James will have of his father." Tucker nodded thoughtfully. "It's a lot for one person to manage." "I've had offers," Willow admitted. "Mr. Hargrove from the general store suggested I sell to him and move into town. Said he'd find me work as a seamstress." "And you didn't consider it?" Tucker asked, studying her profile. Willow shook her head firmly. "This is our home. John and I built it together. His dreams are in every board and nail. I can't just abandon it." Tucker was silent for a moment, his fingers mechanically opening pea pods. "Dreams can change, Willow. They have to sometimes." She looked at him then, or really looked at him. The afternoon sun highlighted the contours of his face, the small scar above his eyebrow, the lines of laughter around his mouth. In just over a week, this man had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully explain. "What about your dreams?" "Tucker?" she asked softly. "Your ranch near Cheyenne." A shadow passed over his features. "Still there, waiting. But sometimes I wonder if I'm chasing the right dream." Their eyes held, and Willow felt that same warmth spreading through her chest, reaching down to her fingertips. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. James's cry from inside the cabin broke the tension, and Willow stood quickly, grateful for the interruption, yet strangely disappointed by it. That evening, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Rain lashed against the cabin windows, and thunder shook the walls with its fury. James, frightened by the noise, refused to be comforted, his wails competing with the howling wind. Willow paced the floor with him, singing lullabies that were lost in the cacophony of the storm. Tucker, seeing her exhaustion, held out his arms. "Let me take him for a while," he offered. "You've been on your feet all day." Gratefully, Willow transferred her son to Tucker's embrace. To her amazement, James's cries immediately began to subside as Tucker cradled him against his broad chest, humming a low, soothing melody. "He likes the rumble in your chest," Willow observed, watching her son's eyelids grow heavy. "Feels safe there." Tucker smiled down at the drowsy infant. "Smart boy." As the storm raged outside, they sat before the fire, James sleeping peacefully in Tucker's arms while Willow darned socks. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly how natural it felt, how right, as if they had been doing this together for years instead of days. "Tucker," she said hesitantly, setting aside her mending, "when you leave." He looked up, his expression serious. "Yes?" Willow faltered, unsure what she had intended to say. Ask him to stay? Suggest she might write to him? Both seemed presumptuous, inappropriate for a widow whose husband had been gone less than a year. "I just wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for everything you've done for us." Tucker's eyes held hers, and she had the unsettling feeling he could see the words she hadn't spoken. "You don't need to thank me, Willow. It's been my privilege." Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark white light, followed immediately by a thunderclap that made the windows rattle. James startled in Tucker's arms, but didn't wake. "That was close," Tucker murmured, adjusting the blanket around the baby. As if in answer, there came a tremendous cracking sound from outside. Followed by a heavy crash that shook the cabin, Willow jumped to her feet. "What was that?" Tucker carefully transferred James to her arms and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. A flash of lightning revealed the damage a large tree had fallen across the corner of the barn roof, caving in a section of the structure. "The barn's been hit," he reported grimly. "Need to check on your livestock." Before Willow could protest, Tucker had grabbed his coat and hat and was out the door, limping slightly on his healing ankle. Willow clutched James to her chest, watching anxiously through the window as lightning periodically illuminated Tucker's progress toward the damaged barn. Minutes stretched like hours as she waited, rocking James and murmuring reassurances more to herself than to her sleeping child. When Tucker finally returned, he was soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "The animals are fine," he reported, shedding his dripping coat, "but the roof's taken significant damage. The rain's pouring in." Willow closed her eyes briefly in relief that her cow and 2 horses were unharmed. The barn could be repaired. The livestock represented her livelihood. "In the morning, I'll see what can be salvaged," Tucker continued, running a hand through his wet hair. "For now, I've moved the animals to the sheltered side." "Thank you," Willow said, the words completely inadequate for the risks he had taken on her behalf. "You shouldn't have gone out there with your ankle." Tucker shrugged, a half-smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "It's healing well enough." He shivered slightly, his wet clothes clinging to him. "You need to get warm," Willow insisted, moving to the trunk at the foot of her bed. She pulled out a shirt and trousers that had belonged to John. These might fit. They were John's. Tucker took the clothes with a respectful nod and disappeared behind the curtain to change. When he emerged, Willow felt a peculiar jolt at the sight of him in her husband's clothing. The shirt strained slightly across Tucker's broader shoulders, but otherwise the fit was reasonable. "Much obliged," he said, noticing her stare. "I hope it's not uncomfortable for you, seeing me in these." Willow shook her head, surprising herself with the truth of it. "No. It's good to see them being used rather than sitting in a trunk." They fell silent, the rain drumming steadily on the roof, the occasional rumble of thunder now more distant as the storm moved on. James slept peacefully in his crib, undisturbed by the commotion. "I should try to get some sleep," Willow said finally, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the dimly lit cabin, how intimate the space felt with the storm isolating them from the rest of the world. Tucker nodded, moving toward his bedroll by the stove. "Good night, Willow." "Good night, Tucker," she replied, retreating behind the curtain to her bed. But sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the rain and thinking about the man on the other side of the curtain, a stranger who had become something else entirely in the span of 10 days. A friend? Yes, but there was more to it than that. The way her pulse quickened when their hands touched, the warmth that bloomed inside her when he smiled. The sense of rightness she felt when he held James, these were not the feelings of mere friendship. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it brought a strange sense of peace. She wasn't betraying John's memory by feeling this way. She was honoring the love he had shown her by recognizing that her heart was still capable of it. Morning brought clear skies and the full revelation of the storm's damage. The massive oak had split nearly in two, half of it crushing the barn's roof and leaving a gaping hole where rain had soaked the hay stored inside. Tucker assessed the damage with a practiced eye. "It's repairable," he declared, "but it will take several days of work and some help." Willow's heart sank. Her nearest neighbors were miles away, and hiring help would cost money she didn't have to spare. "Perhaps Mr. Jenkins could spare his boys," she said, though she knew the likelihood was slim. Tucker was quiet for a moment, looking from the barn to Willow and back again. "I could stay," he offered finally, "help you rebuild before winter sets in." Hope flared in Willow's chest, quickly tempered by practicality. "What about your ranch, your breeding stock in Laramie?" Tucker shrugged, his expression unreadable. "The cattle can wait a few more weeks. They won't be moved till spring anyway." "I can't ask you to do that," Willow protested, even as relief flooded through her at the thought of not facing this new challenge alone. "You didn't ask," Tucker pointed out with a slight smile. "I offered." Their eyes met, and Willow saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch a tenderness, a question, a possibility. She looked away first, suddenly flustered. "If you're sure," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "we would be grateful for your help." And so Tucker stayed. Word was sent to Jenkins and other neighbors, and over the next few days, men arrived on horseback to assist with the heavy lifting. Under Tucker's direction, the damaged section of the roof was cleared, and new beams were set in place. Willow provided meals for the workers and helped where she could while caring for James. She couldn't help but notice how naturally Tucker assumed leadership, how the other men responded to his quiet authority and clear instructions. He worked alongside them, his injured ankle seemingly forgotten as he climbed ladders and lifted heavy timbers. By the end of the week, the barn stood solid again, its new roof section a lighter color than the weathered wood surrounding it. "It's not pretty, but it'll keep your animals dry," Jenkins commented as the men prepared to leave. He glanced from Willow to Tucker, his expression curious. "You found yourself a good hand there, Mrs. Kane." Willow felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the implication in his tone. "Mr. Wade has been very kind to help us." Jenkins nodded, a knowing look in his eye. "Kind indeed. Well, winter's coming. Good to have a strong man around." With that parting observation, he mounted his horse and rode off, the other neighbors following. Left alone, Willow and Tucker stood awkwardly in the yard, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. "Thank you," Willow said finally, "for organizing everything, for staying." Tucker nodded, his eyes warm as they met hers. "Couldn't leave you with a hole in your roof, could I?" The days grew shorter and colder as October gave way to November. Tucker continued to find reasons to stay. Wood needed chopping for winter. The chicken coop needed reinforcing against predators. The vegetable cellar needed reorganizing. Each morning, Willow expected him to announce his departure, and each evening, she felt guilty relief when he didn't. They fell into a comfortable routine. Tucker would rise before dawn to tend to the animals while Willow prepared breakfast. They would work together during the day, breaking for meals and to care for James, who had begun to show a distinctive personality stubborn like his father, Tucker often remarked, but with his mother's expressive eyes. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Tucker taught Willow poker, using beans as chips, and she surprised him with her quick grasp of strategy. Willow taught Tucker to knit, his large hands awkwardly wielding the needles until he produced a misshapen square that made them both laugh. On cold nights, Tucker would play his harmonica, the melodies filling the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Sometimes Willow would sing along softly, her clear voice blending with the instrument's plaintive notes. James thrived under their shared care. He rolled over for the first time one evening as they watched, his chubby legs kicking in triumph at his new skill. Tucker celebrated the milestone as enthusiastically as Willow, scooping the baby up and tossing him gently in the air to make him giggle. "He's got your smile," Tucker observed one night as James beamed up at them from his blanket on the floor. Willow looked at her son, then at Tucker. "And your stubbornness, it seems." Tucker laughed, the sound rich and full. "Can't blame that on me. Must be hereditary." Willow smiled, but a shadow passed over her features. James would never know John, would grow up with only stories and a faded photograph to connect him to his father. It seemed unfair, this theft of relationship that death had imposed. As if reading her thoughts, Tucker said quietly, "He'll know his father through you, Willow, through the stories you tell and the values you teach him." Willow nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Sometimes I worry I won't be enough." Tucker's expression grew serious. "You're more than enough. But that doesn't mean you have to do it all alone." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Willow wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. She busied herself with picking up James, avoiding Tucker's gaze. "It's late," she said. "We should all get some rest." The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that turned the world white overnight. Willow woke to find Tucker already outside, clearing a path to the barn. She watched from the window, James on her hip, as Tucker worked methodically, his breath visible in the cold air. "Look, James," she murmured to her son, "your first snow." The baby stared wide-eyed at the transformed landscape, reaching out as if trying to touch the white flakes falling past the window. Willow smiled at his wonder, remembering her own childhood delight in the first snows of the season. When Tucker came inside, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, James squealed and reached for him, a new development that both surprised and pleased Willow. Tucker took the baby with a grin, settling him on his shoulders. "Want to see the snow, little man?" he asked, moving toward the door. "Just for a minute so you can feel it." Willow wrapped a blanket around James and followed them onto the porch. Tucker held the baby's tiny hand out to catch a snowflake, explaining in his deep voice about winter and weather, as if James could understand every word. The baby listened solemnly, his eyes fixed on Tucker's face, with a trust that made Willow's heart ache with a complex mixture of emotions. That night, after James was asleep, Tucker stared into the fire with an uncharacteristic silence that made Willow nervous. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally, setting aside her mending. Tucker looked up, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking, Willow. I've stayed far longer than I planned." Her heart sank. Here it was the departure she had been dreading. "You have responsibilities at your own ranch," she said, keeping her voice even with effort. Tucker nodded slowly. "Yes, but that's not what's been on my mind." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this, and there may not be one, so I'll just speak plainly. I care for you, Willow. For you and James both." Willow's breath caught in her throat as Tucker continued, his blue eyes earnest in the firelight. "I know it's too soon. I know your heart still belongs to John, and I would never try to replace him. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you might have room for someone else in your life, I would count myself the luckiest man alive to be considered." Tears filled Willow's eyes at his words, so honest and respectful of her grief, yet so full of hope. "Tucker, He held up a hand, stopping her. You don't need to answer now, or ever, if that's your choice. I just wanted you to know before I leave." "Leave?" The word escaped her before she could stop it, revealing more than she intended. Tucker's expression softened. "I need to check on my property, make arrangements for the winter. But I could come back if you wanted me to." Willow looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "What about your ranch? Your dreams?" "Dreams change," Tucker said simply, echoing their conversation from weeks before. "Sometimes they grow to include more than we ever imagined." Willow thought about the past month, how Tucker had stepped into their lives and filled a void she hadn't fully acknowledged, how natural it felt to work alongside him, to share meals and conversations, to watch him with James. She thought about the warmth that filled her when he smiled, the sense of safety she felt in his presence, the way her heart quickened when their hands touched. "I care for you too," she admitted softly, the words both frightening and freeing. "More than I thought possible." Tucker's eyes lit with hope, but he remained where he was, giving her space. "But," he prompted gently, sensing her hesitation. "But I'm scared," Willow confessed. "Of what others might think, of whether it's too soon, of trusting my heart again when it's been so broken." She paused, gathering courage. "And I'm afraid of what happens if you leave and don't come back." Tucker moved then, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his. "Willow, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, his voice steady. "I can't promise life won't bring more hardships, but I can promise you won't face them alone if you'll have me by your side." Willow searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his gaze. Slowly, she leaned forward until their foreheads touched, a gesture of trust more intimate than words. "Come back to us," she whispered. "That's all I ask for now." Tucker nodded, his hands tightening around hers. "I will. You have my word." 2 days later, Tucker rode out, promising to return before Christmas. Willow stood on the porch with James in her arms, watching until he disappeared from sight around the bend in the trail. The cabin felt emptier than she could have imagined, as if Tucker had taken something essential with him when he left. "He'll be back," she assured James, who seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and fussed in her arms. He promised. The days passed slowly. Willow kept busy with preparations for winter, smoking the last of the meat, checking the stores of preserved vegetables, making sure the cabin was properly sealed against drafts. Each night, she would stand on the porch for a moment before bed, looking out at the trail that led east, wondering where Tucker was and if he was thinking of them. A week after Tucker's departure, Jenkins rode by with his youngest son to check on her. As they were leaving, the old farmer cleared his throat awkwardly. "That Wade fellow," he began, adjusting his hat, "seems like a decent man." Willow nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "He is." Jenkins studied her face. "Life's short out here, Mrs. Kane. Too short for unnecessary loneliness." With that cryptic remark, he touched the brim of his hat and rode away, leaving Willow to wonder at his meaning. As November waned, Willow began to watch the trail more anxiously. Tucker had said he would return before Christmas, but winter travel could be unpredictable. What if he encountered difficulties? What if he changed his mind? James seemed to miss Tucker too. He would perk up at the sound of approaching horses, only to grow fussy when it wasn't the visitor he expected. Willow found herself talking to him about Tucker, showing him the harmonica Tucker had left behind, promising that their friend would return. Friend. The word no longer seemed adequate for what Tucker had become to them, a vital presence in their lives, a source of strength and joy, a man whose absence left a hollow space that nothing else could fill. One evening, as a fierce December wind howled around the cabin, Willow sat rocking James by the fire. The baby was restless, fighting sleep despite the late hour. "I know," Willow murmured to him. "I miss him too." As if her words had conjured him from the storm, there came a knock at the door. Willow's heart leaped to her throat as she rose quickly, James in her arms. She hesitated only briefly before opening the door. There stood Tucker, snow dusting his broad shoulders, his face reddened by the cold. Behind him, a loaded wagon stood in the yard, covered with a tarp against the weather. "Tucker," Willow breathed, relief and joy washing over her in equal measure. He smiled, removing his hat. "I promised I'd be back before Christmas." James recognized him immediately, reaching out with eager arms and a gummy smile that made Tucker laugh as he stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. "There's my boy," he said, taking James from Willow. "Have you been good for your mama?" As Tucker bounced James on his knee, warming himself by the fire, Willow noticed a change in him, a new certainty in his movements, a settled calm in his expression. "You've been busy," she observed, nodding toward the wagon visible through the window. Tucker nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have. I've squared things away at my place, made arrangements for my stock to be tended." He paused, adjusting James on his lap. "And I've brought some things, if you're agreeable." "Things?" Willow echoed, curious. "My tools, some furniture, books." Tucker took a deep breath. "Everything I own that matters." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're not going back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tucker shook his head, his expression serious. "Not unless you send me away." Willow sank into the chair opposite him, her legs suddenly unsteady. "But your ranch—" "I've leased it to the Peterson brothers for the winter," Tucker explained. "Good men, they'll take care of it. In the spring, we can decide what to do with it. Together, if you'll have me." "Together," Willow repeated, the word both thrilling and terrifying. Tucker set James gently on his blanket and moved to kneel before Willow, taking her hands in his as he had that night before he left. "I've had a lot of time to think on the trail, Willow, about what I want, what I hope for." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I want to be here, with you and James, not just for the winter, but for all the seasons to come." Tears filled Willow's eyes as the full meaning of his words sank in. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Tucker smiled, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a simple silver band. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Willow Kane, not to replace what you had with John, but to build something new together." Willow looked at the ring, then at Tucker's face, earnest, hopeful, patient. She thought of their month together, of how naturally he had fit into their lives, of the way he cared for James as if the boy were his own. She thought of the loneliness that had enveloped her when he left, and the joy that had flooded her heart when he returned. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger as certainty filled her. "Yes, I will marry you, Tucker Wade." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the promise it represented, not an ending to her grief, but a beginning of something new and unexpected. Tucker leaned forward and kissed her then, a gentle, questioning kiss that Willow answered with a certainty that surprised them both. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, her hands framing his face. "Welcome home," she whispered. On Christmas Eve, with a light snow falling outside, Tucker and Willow were married in their cabin. Jenkins and his wife stood as witnesses, along with a few other neighbors who braved the winter weather for the occasion. The local preacher performed the simple ceremony, his words nearly drowned out by James, who chose that moment to demonstrate his newly discovered vocal range. Tucker took the interruption in stride, scooping up the baby halfway through the vows. "We come as a package," he told the amused preacher. "Might as well make it official with all parties present." And so, Tucker held James as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Willow for all the days of his life. When the time came to seal their vows with a kiss, he included James in their embrace. The three of them linked in a circle that felt both new and as old as time itself. Later, after their guests had gone and James was finally asleep, Tucker and Willow stood on the porch, watching the snow transform their world into a glistening wonderland. Tucker's arm encircled her waist, pulling her close against the cold. "Are you happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Willow turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had ridden into her life by chance and stayed by choice. "More than I thought possible," she answered truthfully. Tucker smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way that made her heart flutter. "That midnight when James was crying, and I offered to rock him, did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Willow laughed softly, remembering her suspicion, her exhaustion, her reluctant trust. "Not for a moment, but I'm grateful every day that you offered." Tucker kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and passion and future. When they separated, breathless and smiling, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with tender familiarity. "Come inside, Mrs. Wade," he said, his voice husky. "It's cold out here." Hand in hand, they returned to the warmth of their cabin, to the life they were building together, step by careful step. Spring came to Wyoming territory in fits and starts, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, the land gradually awakening from its winter slumber. On the Kane-Wade homestead, new life emerged in more ways than one. The vegetable garden, expanded under Tucker's careful planning, sprouted rows of green seedlings. The cow delivered a healthy calf in early April, and the chicken coop bustled with activity as hens sat on clutches of eggs. Inside the cabin, which Tucker had gradually expanded over the winter, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area, James took his first wobbling steps, falling more often than he succeeded, but getting up each time with determined grunts that made his parents laugh. "Stubborn as his mother," Tucker would say, catching the boy before he could tumble into the table. "Strong-willed as his father," Willow would counter, her heart full as she watched the man who had chosen to be James's father in every way that mattered. They had decided to keep both properties, the homestead where they lived and Tucker's ranch near Cheyenne. With the help of the Peterson brothers, who agreed to continue working the distant property for a share of the profits, they were slowly building a modest cattle operation that might one day support them comfortably. Life wasn't without its challenges. There were still nights when James cried inconsolably, testing their patience and endurance. There were days when the work seemed endless and the rewards distant. There were moments when Willow found herself missing John with an ache that couldn't be shared, even with Tucker. But there were also mornings when she woke to find Tucker already up, James on his shoulders as they went about the early chores, the baby's delighted giggles drifting through the window. There were evenings when they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in impossible colors, their fingers intertwined and their dreams aligning like stars. On a warm May evening, as they sat together after putting James to bed, Willow turned to Tucker with news she had been keeping close to her heart until she was certain. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice soft with wonder. Tucker looked up from the bridle he was repairing, his expression curious. "What is it?" Willow took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, still flat but harboring their secret. "We're going to have a baby. In the winter." Tucker's eyes widened, joy spreading across his features like dawn breaking. "A baby? You're sure?" Willow nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Dr. Jenkins confirmed it yesterday when he was here checking on Mrs. Peterson." Tucker gathered her in his arms, his embrace careful yet exuberant. "A baby," he repeated, awe in his voice. He pulled back to look at her face, his expression suddenly concerned. "How are you feeling? Is there anything you need? Should you be resting more?" Willow laughed at his rapid-fire questions. "I'm fine, Tucker. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," he said seriously, "not carrying my child." His hand returned to her stomach, protective and reverent. "Our child." "Our child," Willow agreed, placing her hand over his. "A brother or sister for James." Tucker kissed her then, a kiss that contained all the words they didn't need to say: gratitude for the life they had found together, hope for the future they were building, love that had grown from an unexpected midnight encounter into the foundation of their shared life. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, their family bloomed too. Willow's body rounded with new life, and James grew more adventurous by the day. his vocabulary expanding to include a version of "pa" that made Tucker's eyes shine with pride. One night in July, as a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, they found themselves in a scene that echoed their beginning. James, unsettled by the thunder, refused to sleep. As midnight approached, Willow, her back aching with the weight of her pregnancy, paced the floor with him, singing lullabies that had no effect on his wailing. Tucker, who had been checking on the animals in the barn, came in to find his wife exhausted, her eyes shadowed with fatigue as she bounced their son in her arms. Without a word, he crossed to her, his hands gentle as he took James from her. "Go rest," he said, echoing the words that had changed their lives a year ago. "I'll rock him till he sleeps." Willow smiled, recognizing the moment for what it was, not just a kindness from husband to wife, but a renewal of the promise that had brought them together. The promise that neither of them would face life's challenges alone again. "I love you," she said simply, rising on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Both of you." As she retreated to their bedroom, she paused in the doorway to watch Tucker settle into the rocking chair with James, his deep voice rumbling a story about brave horses and distant mountains. Outside, the storm continued its journey across the vast Wyoming sky, but within the walls of their home, all was peaceful. In that moment, Willow knew with bone-deep certainty that some storms brought not destruction, but renewal, washing away what was to make room for what could be. Her midnight tears had led to morning joy, her loneliness to companionship, her grief to a love that encompassed, but did not erase what came before. And as the baby within her stirred, a gentle reminder of the future taking shape, Willow silently thanked the twist of fate that had brought a wounded cowboy to her door on that desperate night, changing the course of their lives with a simple offer of kindness. "Go rest. I'll rock him till he sleeps." Words that had built a family, one midnight at a time.